Thanks for watching. Follow a brighter destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Renata Voss said the sentence at 47 in the afternoon, in front of 38 people in a glass-walled office that's like an aquarium in the middle of a working steel floor. Do it my way, or clear out your locker. That sentence had never failed her in 19 years. It had ended careers, ended marriages by proxy, ended man's ability to look at himself in a mirror more times than she could count. And every single time it worked. It worked because she had already made sure it would. Daniel Cross did not raise his voice. He did not raise his eyes either, not right away. Nearly 3 full seconds he sat perfectly still, and in a room that size, seconds of silence is a very long time. Then he closed the folder in front of him, squared its edges against the desk like he was lining up dominoes, and set his pen down beside it without a sound. That was the part nobody in that room forgot. Not the shouting, 'cause there wasn't any. Quiet, he stood. He unclipped the laminated badge from his belt loop and placed it face down on the corner of Renata's desk. He picked up the gray canvas duffel he kept under his chair, the one that had held his lunch in his gloves, and folded at the bottom where nobody ever looked, a photograph of a woman who wasn't in his life anymore, and a boy who very much was. He slung the strap over his shoulder. Through the glass behind him, 38 steelworks coveralls had stopped their machines to watch, the way a crowd stops on a highway to look at something they don't want to look at, but can't help looking at. Renata's voice found an edge it hadn't needed to find in a long time. Daniel. Think about Eli. He stopped walking. He turned around. Turn. He looked at her. A question you didn't. He said nothing. He nodded. Quite small, the way you nod at a stranger who has offered you a seat you don't need. And he walked the rest of the way to the door, past the machines he had run for 11 years, past the workers who had parted for him without knowing why, and out into the Akron afternoon. Renata Voss stood alone in the wreckage of a perfect record, and she had not admitted yet that in the next 90 seconds, everything she believed about people was about to start coming apart at the seams. You're going to want to know what she asked him to do. A man doesn't walk away from 11 years and a kid at home over nothing. Stay with me, because the answer is coming. And it's worse than you think, but first you need to understand the woman who was so certain he couldn't say no, and the thing she never once bothered to check. Renata Voss had one theory about human beings, and she would have denied holding it if you'd asked her directly. But she had built an entire career defending it in practice. A person, fashion she believed, is tied to a number. Somewhere in their life, there is a monthly figure rent, a car note, a kid's race, a mother's medication, and that figure is the leash. You don't have to be cruel to control someone. You just have to find their number, make it clear you're holding the other end of the rope, and then you don't even need to pull hard. They come on their own, because a person who is 3 missed paychecks from disaster does not get to have principles. They get to have hope, and hope folds. It's not a stupid theory. That's the part that made her dangerous. It was mostly true, and 19 years of being right had turned her into the kind of executive who didn't inspire loyalty so much as harvest compliance, floor by floor, division by division, one quiet ultimatum at a time. Do it my way, or clear out your locker. She never fired that sentence at random. She checked first savings, dependents, alternatives, cushioned the way a hunter checks the wind before a shot, and she only ever pointed it at someone she'd already confirmed was standing unarmed. So when the ugliest assignment of her career landed on her desk, she went looking for the most trapped person with the authority to carry it out. And on paper, Daniel Cross was close to perfect. A single father, one income, a 13-year-old son named Eli waiting at home with no second salary behind him. Wood, 11 years at the plant, which meant his whole professional identity lived inside that one building. Wood, an old Ford pickup with 191,000 miles on it, a small rented house on Larchdale Street, no boat, no new phone, nothing that whispered money. Wood, by every measure she used, he was the most leashed man on the floor. That's why she picked him, not despite his son, because of his son. The assignment was this. Harrow Steel Works was killing a shift line 40 positions gones, a decision made in a boardroom in Cleveland by people whose names Daniel didn't know. Wood, that part was ordinary and ugly, and there was nothing anyone on the floor could do about it. Wood, that wasn't what she asked him to do. What she asked him to do was time it. Wood, every one of those 40 workers hit a 10-year service threshold on October the 3rd, a threshold that under the pension plan Harrow had promised them in writing when they were hired meant fully vested retirement benefits. Lutt cut on September the 19th instead, 2 weeks early. Wood, nothing dramatic, nothing that would look bad in an email, just a schedule moved 14 days to the left so that 40 men and women would walk out the door before they qualified for what a decade of their lives had already earned them. Wood, they'd figure it out, eventually, long after they'd scattered. Long after they had no lawyer and no proof of intent, just a bad feeling that they could never quite pin down. Wood, and because Daniel was the floor supervisor, because his signature was the one that would make the timing look like operations instead of what it actually was, he was the one who had to be the hand. Wood, his crew, the same 38 people watching through the glass right now, would see him hand out those notices. Would think it was him. It's not personal, Renata had told him, with the crew visible in her peripheral vision the whole time. Let's just get shooting. Sign here and we're finished. Daniel had said no. Would. She had blinked, genuinely startled, and explained it to him again, slower. The way you explain something just must have misheard. He'd said no a second time, and on 19 years of muscle memory, she'd pulled the leash. Do it my way, or clear out your locker. And she had watched his face, waiting for the fold she had seen 100 times before, the flicker, the swallow, the quiet okay, fine of a man remembering his kid. He had closed the folder instead. Now, you understand why he didn't argue. Would. He explained it to Eli, much later, at their kitchen table, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the whole engine of this story. Would. If he had argued, if he'd said that's unethical, if he'd pleaded his case, if he'd tried to negotiate the terms, he would have accepted her premise. Would. He would have treated cheating 40 people out of a decade's worth of promises as a position reasonable adults could debate over coffee. Would. And a man who spends 20 minutes eloquently explaining why he won't cross a line has already spent 20 minutes standing on it. He didn't debate. He left. The silence was the answer. The duffel bag on his shoulder was the answer. It said, more clearly than any speech could have, you asked me to become a certain kind of man. And my answer is that I'm going to go be a different one, starting now. Would. But it still leaves the question that was chasing him across that factory floor. Renata had shouted at his back. Would. How could he afford to just walk? The answer was 11 years old, and it was sitting in a credit union account nobody at Harrow Steel Works had ever heard of. Would. 11 years earlier, back when Eli was still small enough to ride on his shoulders, and Daniel was newly raising him alone. In shop, machine shop 2 towns over, that rearranged the rest of his life. Would. A coworker named Frank Albee, good man, 3 kids, a mortgage he couldn't breathe under, had been told to falsify a safety inspection log. Daniel had watched Frank's face while he did it, not because Frank wanted to. Would, because he couldn't afford not to. Daniel drove home that night, and sat at his kitchen table for a long time, and he came to a conclusion. Most people never quite put into words. Most people don't do the wrong thing because they're bad. They do it because they can't afford to be good. Good. And the world is arranged, quietly and conveniently, so that most working people stay exactly 3 missed paychecks from disaster forever. He decided, at 23 years old, that he would never be Frank Albee. Good. And he understood this is the important part, that not becoming Frank wasn't a matter of character. Wasn't about being braver or more principled. It was a matter of arithmetic. You don't become unownable by wishing it. You build it slowly in the most boring way imaginable over years. Good. So for 11 years he drove the truck with 191,000 miles on it instead of trading it in. Because a car payment is a link in somebody else's leash. Good. He rented the small house on Larchdale Street and lived on roughly half his paycheck instead of most of it. Because a big mortgage is the strongest leash ever invented. He skipped the vacations. He wore the same brown coat for 6 winters. He fixed things instead of replacing them, and fixed month with telling a soul, not a coworker, not a friend, not even Eli. He moved a set amount in to and he never touched. Would. $430 a month, give or take, sometimes less in a bad month, sometimes a little more. He wasn't saving for a house. He wasn't saving for retirement. Would. He was saving for one specific conversation, the one watched happen to Frank Albee, the one he knew was coming eventually for every working man with a boss and a mortgage. The day with power over him would look him in the eye, tell him to do something wrong, and make the price of refusing very clear. Good. By the time Renata Voss called him into that glass office, the account held $1,190.60, call it a year, roughly, of bare-bones expenses. Good. A year to find another job without panic. A year with no one on earth able to fit a leash around his neck and pull. Good. He used to say it to himself in the bathroom mirror on hard mornings. Courage isn't a moment, it's a balance sheet. Don't buy things. Buy the ability to say no. And then there was Eli. Eli Cross was 13, and he had spent a good chunk of the last few years quietly, resentfully embarrassed by his father. And that's maybe the saddest thread in this whole story, because Eli didn't know a single thing about the account. How do you explain that to a kid? So all Eli ever saw was the cheapness. Good. The truck other boys' dads lapped about in the pickup line at Firestone Middle School. Good. Birthday gifts that were thoughtful and never cool. The trips to the Outer Banks that everyone else's family posted photos from every August while the Cross house stayed quiet. Good. My dad's the guy who never spends money. He'd think and never once say it out loud. And Daniel had known about that little hard shell of shame for years. Swallowed it because he'd made a bet 11 years earlier that one day something would happen that would make his son understand. That day turned out to be a Tuesday. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Daniel Cross closed a folder in a glass office and walked out of a building. Wood. And the reason he could do it without folding, without even needing to raise his voice, was sitting untouched in a credit union account built dollar by dollar out of a decade of ugly trucks and skipped vacations and a boy's quiet disappointment. Blood, the most expensive thing he ever bought. It was also the only thing he ever needed. Blood. Let's go back to the glass office, because I want you to see what that silence actually did to her, and to the 38 people on the other side of it who watched the whole thing and understood none of it. Good. Renata Voss had a counter for everything. If Daniel had argued ethics, she'd have called him naive. This is business. You don't understand the pressure we're under. He'd protested. She'd have gone cold and procedural, drowned him in policy language until he ran out of air. Good. If he'd begged, she'd have been generous about it and owned him for a decade. He'd shouted, she'd have had him out a coordinate store for cause and told the building he'd had some kind of episode. Good. 19 years of moves, one for every possible response. She had no move for a man who closed a folder, because silence doesn't give a person like her anything to work with. It refuses the premise entirely. Do it my way, or clear out your locker was, in her mind, a choice, a rigged one, but a choice, and choices were how she controlled people. Lud. The whole trick of a leash is convincing the animal on the other end that those two options are the only two that exist. Daniel stood up and packed his bag. He was testing picking option 2. Lee was refusing to play the game at all, and telling her, in the only language that could have landed, that her entire 19-year method simply did not apply in this particular room. Lud. She was holding a leash that wasn't attached to anything, and she had never once felt that before. Lud. Through the glass, the crew saw something very different. They saw the CEO's mouth moving. Lud. They saw their supervisor of 11 years, the man who knew every one of their kids' names, close a folder, take off his badge, and walk out without looking back, on the exact day rumors of layoffs had started crawling through the break room. You'll already know what 40 frightened people concluded from that. He saw it coming, and he ran. 11 years, and the man just walked. Lud. By that evening, in the parking lot, in text threads, at the bar on Kelly Avenue, the same people Daniel had just sacrificed his career to protect were calling him a coward. Lud. That's the cruelest turn in the whole thing. And it's worth sitting in for a second, because it happens to real people constantly. He took the hit for them, and they thought he'd fired the shot. Renata Voss, being Renata Voss, found a replacement in about 4 hours. Lud. His name was Marcus Doyle, the deputy operations manager, who'd been standing a step behind her in every meeting for 2 years, the ambitious one. Lud, when she gave him the exact same instruction, Marcus asked one question: will this affect my Q4 review? And then he signed. Lud. The cuts went through on September the 19th, precisely as designed, 14 days before the vesting date, dressed up in the language of operational necessity. While it was, by any measure Renata used, a complete success. Lud. Except it never stays quiet. It came apart because of Daniel's paper trail he built as a weapon. All the reporter movie version would have done. He simply refused, in writing, to sign, and a refusal like that leaves a mark. There's a record of who was asked first, and who said no. Lud. There's an original ship, a kind one, and dates that don't line up with anything, except the vesting slates rolled, sitting quietly in Harrow's own file server, patient as a landmine. Lud. 6 weeks later, 40 angry, cheated workers started asking the kind of questions that HR departments dread, and those documents were exactly where they'd always been. The truth surfaced in layers, the way it usually does. Lud. First came the card. Lud. A woman, Des Marsh, worked 12 years and lost to the line for 12 years. 14. Daniel had left behind in his supervisor's desk before he cleared it. Card in Columbus, dated 3 days. The cuts, with a note in Daniel's handwriting on the back. For whoever needs this after me. Would. Then came the phone call. Odessa called that attorney, expecting nothing, and found out Daniel had already been there, not to file a lawsuit, but to ask quietly unpaid. What a worker in his crew's position would prove intentional timing, if it ever came to that. Lud. He'd been building their case before he even had proof it would matter. In the 2 days between his walkout and his unemployment paperwork, came the confirmation, and this is the part that broke the room. Lud, a former HR coordinator named Patricia Vance, who'd sat 2 doors down from Renata's office for 6 years, came forward with the internal memo showing exactly who had been asked first to carry out the September 19th timing, and exactly who had refused. It wasn't Marcus Doyle who'd been asked first. It was Daniel Cross. Lud, and Daniel Cross had said no in front of 38 witnesses in writing, and had never told a single one of them why he walked. Good. 3 of those witnesses testified to what came next, once the union filed and the story reached a labor reporter at the Akron Beacon. Good. Odessa Marsh testified that she had called Daniel a rat to his face in the parking lot 2 days after the cuts, and that he had only nodded and said, "You're allowed to think that." Good. Walt Ryland, the floor's longtime foreman, testified that he had led the effort to freeze Daniel out of the union hall entirely, and that Daniel had let it happen without a word of defense. Good. A third worker, a younger machinist named Priya, no, we'll leave her out of the record here, because there's a fourth voice that matters more, and it belongs to Walt Riley on a Saturday afternoon in October. Good. Walt Riley drove out to the small rented house on Larchdale Street with 15 men behind him, cap in his hands, and knocked on the door. Good. It was Eli who answered it, 13 years old, looking out at 15 grown men who looked like they'd been crying in the truck the whole way over. "They said things about you," Walt managed, once Daniel came to the door. "Lee said you ran." "I know," Daniel said. "It's what it looked like." Good. I'd have thought the same. "We'd think," Walt said, and his voice cracked on the next word. "You knew, and you walked anyway." "Why?" Daniel stood in his own doorway in front of his son, and gave the answer would carry with him for the rest of his life. Good. Because you can't do the right thing and also control what people think of you, Walt. You only get one. Most people pick the second one. He shrugged, small and tired. "I picked the first one." Good. The fallout, once it started, moved the way these things move when there's a paper trail and 40 furious witnesses up past Renata Voss's office into the desks of people at corporate who cared very much about lawsuits and headlines. Good. Harrow Steelworks reversed the vesting dates and paid every dollar owed to every one of the 40 workers, backdated with interest, $12,000 on average per person. Because once it was a say-slot thought, there was no defending it. Good. Marcus Doyle, the man who'd asked about his review before signing, discovered exactly what happens to the hand holding the pen. Once the room fills with light, he was let go within the quarter, and 2 other companies quietly declined to hire him after reference checks. Lotta Voss did not lose her job. The world is rarely that tidy. Good. But she lost the thing she valued more, which was her certainty. And 6 weeks after the story broke, she drove to Larchdale Street herself. Good. She stood on Daniel's porch in a coat. The coat cost more than his truck was worth, and said the thing he hadn't been able to stop turning over for weeks. "I need to understand how you did it." "Not what?" Good. "How?" "I checked you," she said, and there was something raw underneath the words for the first time anyone could remember. Good. "Before I ever brought you into that room, I checked you the way I check everyone. No visible savings. One, a kid, an old truck, a small house. You were the most trapped man on the floor," Daniel said. Good. "That's why you picked me. I knew that the second you opened your mouth." "Wow," she said again. "How do you walk out with a kid at home?" "I had savings," Daniel said. "You just couldn't see them. Because I never spent them on anything you could see." He nodded toward the truck in the driveway. "That's the reason. Vacations we never took. That's the reason, too. I wasn't being cheap, Miss Loss. I was buying something. I was buying exactly one thing, the ability to stand up and walk out of the room you built. Good. It took 11 years to save enough of it, because I watched a good man broken by a decision like that once, and he didn't fold because he was weak. He folded because he was broke." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't lose because I'm braver than the others. I'm not particularly brave. Lost because I could afford it. And they couldn't." Good. "Courage isn't a virtue in a room like yours. It's a balance sheet." Good. "You've spent 19 years beating people who couldn't afford to say no to you, and you mistook that for a truth about human nature." Lotta Voss stood on that porch for a long time before she answered. Good. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 19 years, she said finally. Good. I think it's true. Every person who ever folded for me, I made sure they'd already folded before I asked. Good. I don't think I've ever had a real victory. I think I've just been pulling leashes and calling it management. Good. She offered him his old job back that afternoon. More than his old job, a promotion, a raise large enough to make a point. Good. It was the only language she knew. Daniel turned it down and gave her the line that quietly ends the whole philosophy this story is built on. Respect, ma'am. You're offering me a longer leash. That's all a raise is. Comes from someone who's already shown you they'll pull it. He shook his head. I'll come back. Not for the money. He asked for instead was on theme all the way down. He asked for it in writing, and he asked for it on behalf of every single person on that floor, not just himself, a formal binding right of refusal policy. An employee at any level could decline to carry out an instruction they believed to be dishonest and could not be fired, demoted, or retaliated against for that refusal. Not a values poster in the break room. A mechanism. Wood. A door in the wall. You want to make sure this never happens. Again, he told the executive board 6 weeks later, in a conference room in Cleveland this time, in a hoodie and jeans that made 2 of the board members visibly uncomfortable. It's not a training video. It's not a hotline nobody trusts. It's this. Make it so a person doesn't have to be rich to have principles. Wood. Right now in this company, and in about 1,000 others, the only people who can afford to say no are the ones who don't need the paycheck. Wood. That's not a culture. That's a hostage situation with a dental plan. Wood. Give people a door that doesn't cost their kids dinner to walk through, and you'll find out how many good people you had all along. The board adopted it. It's on a plaque by the time clock at Harrow Steel Works to this day. And the floor workers call it, without irony, and without anyone telling them to, Cross's rule. Wood. 18 months later, a company-wide survey found reported instances of workers refusing unethical instructions had risen from something almost nobody tracked to a number worth publishing. And not one of those workers had been terminated for it. Eli Cross, who had spent years quietly ashamed of an old truck, and a father who never bought anything. Watched 15 grown men stand crying on his porch. Watched a company CEO come to their front door to ask his father how he'd done it. And finally understood something he hadn't had the words for before. One night at their kitchen table, not long after, he said it in a small voice. Dad, all the stuff we never bought, that was this. That's what the money was for. Daniel set down his fork. Good, I never bought us nice thing, buddy, he said. I bought us something better. Bought us the ability to stand up and walk out of a room. He tapped the table once. Nice things are what you buy when you're planning to stay. Good. He nodded toward the door, toward the direction of the plant, toward the whole rigged shape of the working world. Wood. That's what you buy when you're planning to stay free. Wood. I'm sorry it cost you a truck you weren't proud of, and some trips we never took. But when they told me to hurt 40 people or lose everything, I got to say no. Most don't get that choice. Not because they're worse men than me, because they can't afford it. He smiled, tired in a way that looked more like peace than exhaustion. Lud, that's what all those years of no were for, son. Lud, they were for one, yes, when it counted. Eli never complained about the truck again. Lud. Months later, a teacher at Firestone Middle School assigned the class an essay. Write about the wealthiest person you know. Lud. Eli wrote about his father, and Daniel had to step out of the parent conference for a minute when he read it. Lud. Here is the most uncomfortable part of this whole story, and it isn't really about a CEO or a steel plant. Lud. It's about the account you don't have yet. Most people don't do the wrong thing because they're bad. Lud. They do it because they can't afford to be good, and that's exactly what Renata Voss understood. And it's why her method worked for 19 straight years on almost everyone she tried it on. Good. Every person who ever folded for her folded for the same reason. They were tied to a monthly number, and the number was bigger in the net than their principles. Good. Not because they were cowards, because they were leashed. And a leashed person doesn't get to have principles. Good. They get to have regrets. You can be the most honorable person alive in your own heart. And if you are 3 missed paychecks from losing the roof over your kid's head, somebody with power over you can make you do almost anything. Good. And you will do it, and you will hate yourself quietly for years afterward, and you will do it anyway. Because the kid needs to eat tonight. Good. Courage is not a personality trait. It's a balance sheet. Good. In the actual moment of truth, the one with a mortgage sitting in the room, whether you can say no, rarely has anything to do with how brave you are. Good. It has everything to do with how free you already made yourself, months and years before that moment ever arrived. Good. And real freedom, the kind that lets a man close a folder and walk out of a room where somebody trying to buy him isn't something you can summon on the spot. Good. It's something you build slowly, boringly, almost invisibly. Out of 1,000 small refusals to be owned, the older truck, the smaller show house you can actually afford, the vacation you skip, the money you don't spend, proving to strangers that doing fine. Daniel Cross didn't beat Renata Voss with character. He beat her with 11 years of arithmetic. He'd been quietly building his own door out of that room since before his son could walk. And when the day finally came, he didn't need to be brave. Good. He just needed to close a folder. Somewhere in your future, there's a room like that one, and there's a person in it who has checked your finances the way Renata checked Daniel's, and who is about to ask you to become someone you don't want to be. Good. The only thing that will decide who you turn out to be on that day is whether you can afford to be that person. Every dollar you set aside now isn't money. It's a sentence you'll be able to say later. Good. Every unnecessary thing you don't buy today is a leash you won't be wearing tomorrow. Don't buy the nice things. Buy the ability to stand up and walk out of the room. If this story meant something to you, do one thing before you go. Good. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because next week's story is about a woman who was underestimated in a courtroom for 20 years, and the one day she wasn't. They claim her. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. Good. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional, not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. Good. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.